So let's Control C out of here. Now PM2 is basically a process manager, which basically means that we can write a configuration file and select the file to run, and it will run the file. So there's two things we need to do here, actually. The first thing is within the server file, we need to make a modification. So I'm going to close all of these. And in server, way down at the top, way down at the top, we need to specify where our API listens at. So we're going to pass through a port to this process that's going to be stored in process.env.port or 8080. All right. So what this means is if it's going to prioritize this, so if process.env.port exists, it's going to use that port. Otherwise, it's going to use 8080. Now, this will allow us to set the port through an environment variable, which we need the capability of doing. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to commit these again. So git commit add port env and git push origin master. Good stuff. Now I am going to git pull origin master on my server, and we'll see that it has updated. So now what we need to do is write a configuration file for PM2. And actually, before we do that, let's run sudo apt get install PM2. And that is not, oh right, it's npm install PM2-G for global. And PM2 is going to be the process manager that we use. Now, while that's installing, let's go ahead and add a file to our website backend here. And it is going to be called apps.json. That got spelled way badly. Apps.json. So in here, it's a JSON file. So we're going to open this up basically. And apps is going to be an array of objects. Now each object is going to have a name, so we're going to say demo API 1, and the script is going to be the relative location of the script. So current directory server/server.js. Instances, we'll come back to this, just set it to 1. Exec mode makes the instances property actually matter. We're going to set it to cluster, and I'll explain all this in a few moments. And then when it runs this app, and by this app I mean this right here within the apps list, when it runs this, we now set the environment variables. So env is going to be equal to an object. We're going to set node env. We can set this to production. Port, we're going to set to 8080 for this one. We'll create another one in a second. And that's all we need. Except, actually, we're going to also set node underscore args, and you're going to experience this eventually, probably at some point. Basically, what can happen is a node process can consume up to 1.5 gigabytes of RAM. If you have any large calculations that you're doing that involve a lot of data, and there's a possibility where multiple people can be calling those functions at the same time, it's very easy to straight up run out of RAM, on your server, depending on your specs on your server. And this is something I'm going to talk about in an upcoming video, because there is a great VPS provider, pretty inexpensive compared to alternatives for what they offer you, and you can get some pretty decent RAM. Basically, right now on my server, I think I either have 10 or 12 gigabytes of RAM. So let's do some math here. If I was going to run one instance of this, I could set the node RAM to 8 gigabytes per instance and still have a lot left over for the system and Nginx and all that stuff. I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is we're going to set a node argument, and it's very specific. It's called max_old_space_size equals, and now this argument's value is going to be how much RAM you want to allocate for this process to use. Now, it's important that you give it enough that it makes sense to set it. If you don't expect your API to ever use more than 1.5 gigabytes of RAM and it's not crashing, it will crash. If it runs out of RAM, it will actually, the V8 engine that Node runs on, the underlying engine, the JavaScript engine, will crash if it runs out of RAM. And there's a whole garbage collection process that when it's starting to use a lot of RAM, it will go into the RAM and try and find what it can garbage collect to remove. And if it straight up is trying to use too much RAM, it will fail, it will crash, your API will go down. And two things. One, that's bad. And two, our process manager should handle restarting the API, but that will still make whatever network request that was being processed when the crash happened, it'll make that network request fail. So it still will have impact, even though the process manager is going to bring it right back up. So in this instance, we have a pretty light API. I don't even need to set this property, but I will, and I'll set it to 2048. And it's in megabytes, and it's basically, this number means how much RAM this instance has, and that's it. Now, if you remember, in the server file, we are calling process env port and or 8080, which means that we can now, also start it on another port. And if you recall, in Nginx, we've configured it to have an upstream cluster basically at port 8080 and another instance at 8081. And so I'm going to copy this here, put a comma here, and paste this. And I'm just going to change this port number to 8081. And we're going to save this, and we are going to commit it. Git add a, git commit, message added pm2 config, and git push origin master. Good stuff. So now in our API, let's actually run git pull origin master. And we've now got our apps.js file, or apps.json. So let's do this. If we access nickgermain.com at port 8080, nothing will happen right now. Actually, let me start this. Run npm start, just so we can see the difference here. I'll refresh at port 8080, where we can see that we're hosting our API, right? And if I change this to port 8081 and hit enter, it's going to fail. So we can tell just by this that we have one process running, and that's using the npm start command. So let's Control-C out of here. And now we're going to do something new. We're going to start both of our processes, and we're going to do that running pm2 start apps.json. And we'll see, it looks a little messed up, but it lists both of our apps here. Demo API 1 is online, and it even shows uptime, CPU, memory, stuff like that. So now we can run pm2 status. We can get more information. So we can see they're both in the process of starting up, and during that startup they're looking through the database and trying to find if if roles exist and stuff. That should flatline here pretty soon, the CPU specifically. So let's run pm2 monit. Oh, okay, so that's actually failing. Okay. Module version 6472. Let's Control C. So pm2 stop all, pm2 kill. Node dash phi. All right, so pm2 is trying, it looks like it's trying to use node 12. Oh, right, we only used, did we only use version 10 for the app or the API? NVM use 12, npm rebuild to rebuild sharp. Because that error message we were getting there was basically for sharp. It's saying it was compiled for version 10. Okay, so now on version 12 of Node, we have the API running. Okay, so now let's run pm2 start apps.json, and okay. npm, because we switched, install dash g pm2. Yeah, we switched from npm, or from node 10 to node 12 just now. And so when we installed pm2 earlier, we installed it under node 10. So we need to reinstall pm2 basically. Okay, so now we're good to go. Let's go ahead and run pm2 start apps.json. And there we go. Now, before, what we were seeing with the CPU usage being at over 100% and not ever kind of finding its baseline is when I opened up pm2 monit, which is a command that lets you monitor the instances, we could see there were global errors printing out about sharp not being compiled for the right version of Node. And so what was happening is pm2 was restarting it repeatedly. So now if I run pm2 status, we should see 0 CPU. And I can, click this and we'll see that the RAM kind of, fluctuates a little bit, but not bad. And if I go to this now, we'll see this port is currently active, but now if I also change this to 8081, we'll see that we access the app here as well.